All right, so yesterday's lesson was about sustaining biodiversity. What does the term biodiversity mean? Bio means what, first of all? Bio means what? Did you say everything? Earth? What part of Earth, though? Life. There you go. All right, so bio means life. And what does the term diversity mean? If something is diverse, what does that mean? Is there only one kind of life on Earth? No. So what does diversity mean?
There's a variety.
All right, a variety. I like it. I'm sorry, I can't hear you in the mask. Okay, so we're talking about all kinds of life. So when we talk about biodiversity, we're talking about the number and variety of species in an ecosystem. A healthy ecosystem includes a wide variety of species. And we talked about ecosystems last week. There are now an estimated 13 million species of living organisms on Earth. That's a lot. So the three levels of biodiversity are genetic, species, and ecosystem diversity. Okay, so genetic diversity, okay, we see up here in a vole population. Species diversity in a coastal redwood ecosystem, okay, and then down at the bottom, we see a community and ecosystem diversity across the landscape of an entire region. So some factors that increase biodiversity. So that means that we're introducing more. A diverse habitat, which allows more species to live there. And also things like nutrients, rain, and temperature. Survival. And then things that decrease biodiversity include things like environmental stress on a specific area, the limitation of nutrients or habitat, and the introduction of invasive species, which we are also going to talk about. Geographic isolation. And then we will talk about each of these individually. So up here, there are two terms we need to be familiar with: endangered species and threatened species. And these are things we may have heard of before. So an endangered species is a species of animal or plant life that is seriously at risk of extinction. What does it mean to become extinct? If something becomes extinct. Say that again, I heard three of y'all at once. Gone. Okay, there is no more. Okay, so an endangered species is at risk of becoming extinct. A threatened species is a species that's vulnerable to endangerment in the near future. So they are not quite an endangered species, but they are on their way of becoming there. So global extinction, y'all just told me what extinction was, okay? Typically this results from human activities. Species extinction, okay? This is when some species are more prone because of what they do or where they actually live. So up here you can see some examples and the characteristic that puts them into species extinction. So one that you might see up here a couple times is the blue whale, the bald eagle, the giant panda, a grizzly bear, a Bengal tiger. So up here shows us a diagram of species extinction, just to give you an idea. Those that are extinct, more of, higher percentage would be fish, then mammals, reptiles, plants, and then at the bottom would be birds. So a reason to be concerned, many species have practical value to humans as medicines and foods. Okay, whether we want to think of it that way or look at it that way or not, that is the truth. Okay, so things like quinine comes from the cinchona plant, and this is used to treat malaria. Digitalis comes from the foxglove, which is used to treat heart disease. And then Taxol comes from the Pacific yew plant, and this is a potential anti-cancer drug. Okay, so these can all be beneficial. So a way to remember species extinction is HIPPO. Okay, habitat destruction, degradation, and fragmentation, and we'll talk about these all. Invasive species, population growth of humans, pollution, and over harvest. Okay, so HIPPO, HIPPO. So the first is habitat loss. So this can happen due to just where certain species live. It can also be due to things like hunting. So some examples would be the Indian tiger, the black rhino, the African elephant, and the Asian or Indian elephant. Next is an invasive species. Has anybody ever heard of this? Invasive species? Does anybody know what an invasive species is? No? Okay, so an invasive species is an organism that is not native to an area. Okay, so it has negative effects on our economy, our environment, as well as our health. So a great example of this in North Carolina is kudzu. This is kudzu. It's a vine and it grows on just about anything. Okay, anybody ever see this? Like a green vine that grows on houses? Yeah. Okay. So it was introduced to the southeastern United States to control erosion. But then when something is not native, it doesn't have to compete for things. So therefore it blossoms and it just keeps growing and growing. So some invasive species were introduced intentionally and others obviously were not. Okay, so some were intentional, but typically they are unintentional. So another example is the Argentina fire ant, which was introduced to Mobile, Alabama in 1932 from South America. And they say that it came from ships. And because it has no natural predators, they continue to what? Expand, okay? So, and then they take over. So prevention is the best way to reduce threats from invasive species because once they arrive, it's almost impossible to stop their spread or to slow their spread. Because they have no predators, there's no competition, okay? They spread very, very quickly. So they do not spread wild plants to other areas, do not dump the contents of an aquarium into waterways, wetlands, or storm drains. And when camping, use wood near your campsite instead of bringing firewood from somewhere else. These are ways that we can help prevent bringing in an invasive species. Because like I said, sometimes it's intentional, but most of the time it is not. The next one in HIPPO is population growth. So in 1800, there were fewer than 1 billion people on Earth. And today there are over 7 billion. Who remembers what that curve is that I talked about last week? Takes this shape. What'd I tell you? What am I drawing on the board? What letter is that? No. A J. J-shaped curve. What's that called? It begins with an E. Nope. EX. Nobody. Oh boy. Exponential. That's the human population growth curve. Okay, exponential growth. So increasing human populations have led to increasing threats to biodiversity because human impact plays a major role on the ecosystem. The next letter, P in hippo, pollution. We've talked about pollution. We've talked about point source, non-point source. Okay, so the discharge of toxic synthetic chemicals and heavy metals into the environment has a huge impact on species abundance, and it can also lead to extinctions. So it's important to remember that substances that are natural can become pollution when they are too abundant in a certain area. So even something that is natural, okay, if there becomes too much of it, can be fatal to animals, okay? An example, nitrogen and phosphorus, they lead to those algae blooms that I had talked about in here, and in turn lead to dead zones. Who remembers what those were? What's a dead zone? What's not there anymore? Huh? Life? Yes. Why? What is there a lack of? What kind? Oxygen. Okay? There's a lack of oxygen in those dead zones, so therefore there's no life, because if a fish or life were to travel there, because of the lack of oxygen or no oxygen, it will die. Okay, and then last is O for overexploitation. Okay, so some protected species are killed for their valuable parts. So killing predators and pests. There is legal and illegal trade in wildlife species used as pets or for decorative purposes. So there are certain animals that are hunted and killed for their fur or other valuable parts. Also, there are people who like to take certain wildlife in as pets, okay? And so when we do things like this, these things can also lead to extinction. So some North Carolina endangered species you can see up on the board. Okay, so we've got the flying squirrel, the red wolf, the green turtle, the pitcher plant, the red cockaded woodpecker, and the Atlantic sturgeon. Okay, so these are some examples of endangered species in North Carolina. So they're not extinct, but they are on their way there. One of the last things we're going to talk about are biodiversity hotspots. And if you look up here, these are hotspots in relation to the largest concentrations of rare and potentially endangered species in the United States. So if you were to look up here, where do you see your biggest portion of a hotspot? What is this? Anybody know what state that is? California, that's right. Another big portion, okay, you also see over here, which is what? What state is that? Hawaii, that's right, okay. And then you can see a little bit over in the east. But a big portion is California and a lot of Hawaii. So some efforts that we can do to help. There is what is known as the Endangered Species Act, things like sanctuaries, promoting habitats, advocating, so advocacy, and purchases. Okay, there's lots of things that we can do to help protect endangered species. We can promote habitats, so putting up bluebird boxes with holes too small for invasive species, non-native. Competitors in areas where trees have been cut down have helped reestablish populations. So if something is endangered, we can try to reroute it in the opposite direction.